Hi, my name is Ann Werda. I'm the founder of Kids at the Core. Now let's talk a little bit about our format, because we really have three main formats that we're going to consider when we are writing our assessments. The first one is what we call the selected response assessment. This is where we're going to ask students to select the correct answer from a provided set of answers. Some folks refer to this as the forced choice or the multiple choice. Regardless of which name you prefer to call it, at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're providing the student the correct answer and the incorrect answers and asking them to choose between them. The constructed response assessment is when we're asking a student to write their own response. So it could be solving a math problem and showing their work, or it could be writing a short answer to a question, and this is where the student's constructing their own answer. The performance assessment is when we ask students to demonstrate their understanding by doing something, and it may be creating a product, it may be performing a piece of music, it may be giving a speech, engaging in a discussion, but this typically is when the student's doing something to show you their understanding of that topic. But let's be sure here, your assessment is really only as good as the rubric. So either in our constructed response assessment or our performance assessment, we won't have the ability to measure learning if we don't have a tool to reliably gather that data. So a lot of times teachers will ask us, when should they use a rubric? Well, obviously multiple choice, you don't need to use a rubric. And quite honestly, if it's something that has one right answer to it, and so it's either all or nothing, you typically don't need a rubric there. But in any case where a student is doing something where there's multiple different answers or degrees of proficiency among which they might be measured, you're going to want to use that rubric. So what does a rubric look like? Let's break down the process of developing a rubric, because it's really an important piece for any question that's not a forced choice. When we have a rubric here, we'll notice that across the side here we see rows. These are the criteria. Again, when we think about essential learning or most important skills that we're measuring for growth, these are the criteria. These should follow as the rows of your rubric. Criteria are going to reflect things that are big ideas, things that are essential and important, not the minutia of this particular assignment, but rather the most important skills. So we could call these the priority standards, skills that have leverage, skills that have readiness for the next level of learning, skills that have endurance, or skills that are part of the big ideas. But all of these should go into our decisions about what is the essential elements that we're going to be measuring for the criteria on that rubric. All criteria that we measure needs to be definable, observable, and distinct. So what do we mean by definable? Well, it should have a clear meaning that each student can understand and the teachers can understand so that we can explain it to the students. It should be observable, so something that we can hear or see. You shouldn't have things on your rubric like the student eats healthy at home. Of course, we have no way of really finding out how healthy they're eating at home, so it has to be something that we could see or hear. One of the things that I think we run into a lot of issues is what really is observable. Are there things that we tend to measure that are not observable, like, for example, effort, or there are other intangibles that we measure? Can we measure creativity? A lot of times we'll see creativity written on a rubric. We need to have some serious conversations about what really is observable. So if you're watching this video with a group, this is a great time to pause the video and have a little conversation about measuring things that are observable. And is everything we measure observable? The columns on our rubric are really looking at the levels of performance. So we usually range from ideal to non-evident at all. When we're creating these columns and filling in our boxes, we want to make sure that we're using descriptive language. That means language that depicts what we could see and hear, not necessarily a quality conclusion. So in other words, good or poor. Obviously, these are not descriptions of what we would see. And in terms of reliability for the teacher, it's going to be disastrous because there's really no consistency and description of what the teacher's looking for at any given level of performance. We'll run into the same thing with rubrics like this. Words like numerous, serious, few, perceptive. These kind of words need to be discussed by the team or by the individual creating the rubric. So it's important for teachers to have a conversation about what some means. Is some approximately 50%, whereas most is approximately 75%? Even if you have a conversation about that, you'll become better at using the rubric reliably and defining what your different terms mean. There are examples when you would want to use something like always, some of the time, or never. If there's only 3 rating categories, some of the time is okay because it's either always, never, or something in between. But when you start to get the differentiation between some and most, that starts to get a little bit tricky. Another thing we want to consider about the performance level descriptors is that they should be clear. Both the teacher and the student should understand the meaning. And that also includes using the entire range so that you have performance from the beginning level or non-evident all the way up to what we would consider to be ideal. Parallel descriptors are incredibly helpful, especially for reliable grading, because each single box as you go across the rubric should change only ever so slightly. So performance descriptions at each level of the continuum should talk about incremental improvements. So then how do we use rubrics for growth? Because if we have two different measurement points and we're asking the same student to answer prompts using that rubric, how should we go about doing it? The prompts or the performances that we are going to be choosing and the rubric, of course, must be used consistently. So there has to be a level of endurance. So if the rubric has been designed to be used at multiple tasks, it will be much more helpful for measuring growth. Additionally, the prompts need to be of comparable complexity so we can talk about the growth in the student's performance in those two different moments. The assessment protocol, in other words, the amount of time we give the student, the type of directions we give the student, needs to be repeatable so that this assessment environment is the same or very similar in both cases. Finally, the assessment itself needs to be mirrored. That means the prompts need to be of same level of complexity. The format needs to be the same. If you're going to give the student a graphic organizer, the graphic organizer needs to be present in both cases. And it has to be comparable to talk about growth and learning over time.